Hi, my name is Smith Alham, and it's December 27th. So, I'm going to be talking to you guys about how gender is really determined by your genes and your hormones. So, we'll first start this presentation off on going just kind of basically about the reproductive organs that kind of develop during the embryo based on your gender. So, it's made up of three structures: the gonads, internal genitalia, and external genitalia. And so all of these three subcategories they're determined to be called bipotential, and that basically means that they start as one organ in the embryo when your gametes fuse, and then once your gender has been determined, those um, primary organs will divert into one structure or the other. So, if you were to become a male, your gonads would become testes. If you were a female, they become ovaries. And same thing goes with the internal genitalia and external genitalia. Those become very specialized organ structures. So that's very general. The way gender goes, it's first determined by your genes. And so we'll go over that in the next slide. So when reproduction happens, the sperm cell and the egg cell, which are germ cells, they each have 23 chromosomes. And so when they fuse, that creates the embryo, and that will develop into the fetus. When that happens, they exchange genetic material. It's called genetic recombination. So when that happens, each of those chromosomes, they replicate, and so that embryo will have 46 chromosomes, one from there's 23 chromosomes from the male, the sperm cell, and then 23 chromosomes from the egg cell. And so to be considered a male, you have your genetic chromosomes are an X and a Y, and that's because you have to have at least one Y allele that determines the gender to be considered a male, because the Y chromosome has something called the sex determining region gene on it, and it's only on that gene, it's not on the X. So if a embryo has the genetic code of XY, it will be a male. The presence of the SRY gene is what determines it. And we'll see how that plays into genes after this slide. So if the embryo has two X's, or at least one X and no Y at all, that it will be female. There are mutations that can happen where there'll be one X chromosome, which is known as Turner syndrome, or there are three X chromosomes that can happen, but they're all female because there is no Y chromosome at all. And so, in determining gender, the presence of the SRY gene pretty much determines your gender. And so that presence will cause the gonads to turn into the testes. And so for a male, so that will cause the presence of that Y chromosome will cause the gonads to turn into testes. And so we'll see in the next few slides how that plays out. And then if there is no SRY gene, because there's no Y chromosome in the embryo, it'll turn into the ovaries because there's no Y. And so that will play out into the female reproductive organs. And so we'll go to the next slides about those. So for male development, as we've seen, once there is the Y chromosome, that pretty much determines the first structure, which is the gonads, to turn into the testes. And then those testes start to produce three different hormones. And so those hormones will control the internal genitalia and the external genitalia. So the testes will produce the hormone known as glycoprotein anti-Müllerian hormone, also AMH, and those are produced by Sertoli cells. And so that causes the Müllerian duct to regress. So as we've seen in this slide, you have a Müllerian duct and a Wolffian duct when the two embryos form. And so the AMH hormone will cause it to regress, and testosterone is also produced as an androgen by the interstitial cells, and that will cause Wolffian duct to develop. And so that Wolffian duct will turn into the epididymis, the vas deferens, and the seminal vesicle. That's the internal genitalia. And then the DHT, or dihydrotestosterone, will control the development of your external genitalia and the prostate gland, which is also, the prostate gland is the internal genitalia. And so your external genitalia is the penis and the scrotum. And so some tissues that make up that erectile tissue are called corpus spongiosum and corpora cavernosa. And then there's also the genital tubercle that will be the glans penis. Yeah, so we'll move on to female development. So, as we've seen from our second slide, that if there is no Y chromosome, there is no SRY gene in the embryo, which means that the gonad will become an ovary. And so, similar to male development, or I should say the opposite, because there is pretty much, it's the absence of hormones, so there is no SRY gene, so the ovaries develop, which means there will be no AMH, there won't be any testosterone, and there won't be any DHT, so those things cause all the female reproductive structures to kind of develop. I kind of call it like the default setting, that because nothing's going on, no hormones are really being secreted, so the default is to be female. So the ovaries develop because there are just X chromosomes, and so when there's no testosterone, that causes the Wolffian ducts to regress, because AMH causes Mullerian ducts to regress in the opposite. So Mullerian ducts will develop instead because there is no AMH, and those become the upper vagina, uterus, and the fallopian tubes, and so that's the internal genitalia. And then the absence of the dihydrotestosterone, or DHT, will cause the female external genitalia to form, and so those are like the folds of the skin for the vulva, and folds of the skin for the vagina and urethra, which it's interesting because the labia majora that makes up the vulva is the same embryonic tissue as the scrotum, and then it's the same for the labia minora comprise the vagina, are the same embryonic tissues for the penis. And then, as we saw, the genital tubercle, which is similar to the slide we just saw, that makes the gland penis, now makes the clitoris. So we can see that these structures are by potential because they can turn into male reproductive organs or female reproductive organs. And so we'll probably go to our last slide that really defines like the characteristics between male and female. As that we've seen in the other slides, was that testes and ovaries produce androgens, and these are like the second phase pretty much of gender development, because we've seen gender is pretty much determined by your X and Y chromosomes. Those presents either create a testes or create an ovary, and so the hormones do out the busy work in developing the reproductive organs. So ovaries produce estrogens, which is an androgen, and progestins. They cause females to have breast development, fat distribution upon the hips and upper thighs, pubic and axillary hair, so like the armpit hair growth. And so that causes females to have more of a pear-shaped body with broad hips and narrow shoulders. And then the testes that we've seen have produced testosterone and DHT, and that converts testosterone to DHT as well. And that's responsible for these secondary characteristics, which is a beard, body hair growth, more muscular development, thickening of the vocal cords we talked about in that early slide with the epiglottis. It controls behavioral things, and broad shoulders. And so it will cause males to have more broad shoulders and a narrow waist, which is also known as the inverted triangle. So that kind of concludes our presentation on how gender is determined and develops through genes and hormones. And so a summary of kind of that information is in this concept map that I have provided here. You can kind of use this to help you study and learn these things. You can use paper and just slide it to quiz yourself. I also color coded a couple of things on the left and right to see that those structures become by potential. And you kind of see those arrows that go one way or the other. But that's all for now. Thank you.